Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? This week's news covers a range of subjects. This includes a very high success rate for the Pfizer vaccine in young children, the benefits of vaccines going from mother to offspring, results from the World Health Organization's investigation into the origins of the CCP virus, creations of an artificial cell, and an AI that is, well, let's say, interesting. These and more news items can be found at the timestamps below. Let's start with what's happening with the Pfizer vaccine and children aged 12 to 15. At present, the Pfizer vaccine has only been approved for adults. Pfizer is looking to get approval for adolescents, preferably right from the 10 years to 18 years. In reality, that might be a more difficult hurdle. What they're hoping though with these initial results is that they can get at least some of the approvals through for ages 12 to 15. Those results show a 100% effectiveness in their final trial. That's extremely good and on par with everything else we've seen. It seems to prevent the most extreme of symptoms in these young children. The original emergency approval was given for anyone 16 and over. This trial showed a 95% effectiveness. That would mean that based on these results, getting the vaccine at a younger age is more beneficial than when you are only a few years older. Taking the idea of vaccines and how they can be more beneficial the younger you are, and extending that idea just a little further, we have studies looking at the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines in the context of pregnancy. At present, there are no obvious risks associated with the vaccine and pregnancy, but it also hasn't been approved in that context. It's generally been considered a more cautious and prosaic approach to avoid being vaccinated if you intend to get pregnant or are pregnant. This doesn't mean that in all cases that has been possible. In some instances, women have been vaccinated while they were pregnant. Looking at one study involving 131 women, of which 84 were pregnant, researchers found that the antibodies generated from the vaccination and the immunity imparted by that were passed on to the offspring in utero. This meant that they were able to start life with a resistance from the vaccine that would make them more resistant to the CCP virus. What might take you by surprise is the fact that those who had been vaccinated versus those who had had exposure to the CCP virus had a higher antibody level than those who had been exposed to the CCP virus. That means the vaccine gave a better immunological protection than the disease itself did. This, along with research from the CDC back in March looking at pregnancy and vaccinations, strongly supports the use. In that 30,000 strong study by the CDC with pregnancy in mind, there were no adverse results. Overall, this would indicate that being vaccinated while pregnant isn't going to cause any harm. However, if it makes you feel more comfortable, you could either be vaccinated beforehand or wait until having had children. If you aren't going to be able to wait or need to be able to be vaccinated, it's also not going to harm you in any particular way. This is opposed somewhat to other research, which shows that some healthcare workers could be at greater risk than others based on the nature of their occupation and aerosol spreads. This research comes out of Australia, and it's looking at frontline healthcare staff, those that should be wearing a mask when interacting with patients, and whether or not this is enough. This research has found in very short that talking loudly, coughing repeatedly, and breathing heavily can produce drastically more viral particles than simple breathing. 300 times more particles than quiet breathing, in fact. That's a lot. Coughing and deep breathing could produce 100 times more aerosols if a patient is on oxygen. This creates a problem. Oxygen is one of the first treatments patients can be given for respiratory problems, such as those caused by the CCP virus. The particles are different to respiratory droplets. Respiratory droplets are much larger, and they only travel 1 to 2 meters, approximately 6 feet. In that time, they will drop to the floor and cease being as much of a risk. These small respiratory particles in the air are an aerosol, and because they're so small, they remain suspended for far longer. This poses a far greater infection risk, especially in small confined spaces, such as a hospital. This research appears to match with evidence accrued about the infection risk for staff overall, looking at both Australia and the United Kingdom. The simple version of which is that there's up to 3 times more risk for staff who are using non-N95 respirator type masks. These masks are common in intensive care units along with other personal protective equipment. Other staff tend to use less specialized and rigorous, or perhaps more accurately, strongly filtered masks, and this would explain why they have a higher risk of infection when combined with something like these respiratory aerosols that can find their way through surgical masks. Now for the final piece of news this week on the CCP virus, and this is about the World Health Organization's report on the virus itself. The virus has, in short, declared that the virus is likely to have leapt from bats to humans, having no intermediary species. They state that, while unlikely, it is possible that the virus may have originated outside China. There are also some other concerning contents. Overall, it doesn't seem to shed any more light on what we know about the virus, which is unfortunate. That seems to have been the entire point of the investigation, if you want to call it that. The idea was to figure out where it came from, how it got there, and how it started spreading. That was hard enough to do when you have the investigation start more than a year after the disease had spread from that location. In fact, closer to 15 months. That big gap, along with an uncooperative government in the form of the Chinese Communist Party, meant that it was practically impossible for this report to be anything but a rather useless waste of paper. Some of the included arguments are even more concerning, and you can find in the description below links to articles from academics who have, if not eviscerated, certainly laid bare many of the problems with this report. Going now from a disease that jumped from a bat to humans somehow, we can look at a gene that has jumped from a plant to an insect. This phenomena is not impossible. It's just not something we see very often. The report is interesting because it explains how the whitefly, when it was eating a certain crop, it was able to eventually adapt a certain gene that allowed it to deal with the toxins that some of the plants it would eat produced to prevent it from consuming them. This is particularly useful in terms of survivability, not so much in terms of agriculture as it made combating a pest species that much more difficult. The way this happened isn't entirely clear, but it is possible that through an intermediate virus, the fly was able to take on the gene, as the virus would insert itself carrying that gene or version of it, and the fly's genome would then take it and hold on to it permanently. Having imparted some sort of advantage, those particular flies would breed more prolifically, leading to an increase in that gene's spread. Going from nature and how it finds a way, we're now going to go to the artificial life that's been created in a lab. the creation of an artificial cell that will grow and then divide, exactly the same way a normal life form would, something from nature or even in your own body. The creation of this new synthetic single-celled organism, which effectively mimics life, is both impressive and somewhat disconcerting. It has, as a result of how difficult the process of creating life is, taken decades. And those decades haven't been without their difficulties either. This hasn't been a slow but steady progress. Rather, they've constantly found roadblocks of one kind or another, different impediments to trying to model just how a cell works when they're creating it, or more accurately, engineering it. In the last 10 years, they've been able to create a cell, and this cell was able to continually culture itself and keep growing. The problem with these cells were that, although they were tiny genetically, only 473 genes in total, they couldn't keep their structure the same. There was a lot of morphological variation. This meant you get different shapes, sizes, and it was simply inconsistent, something you don't see in a normal cell. Cells, when they replicate and divide, are nearly always exact copies of each other. Occasionally you get a mutation thrown in, but these mutations are either weeded out or become dominant. Adding 19 genes, although only a fraction of these are thought to be responsible for the changes seen, led to a far more effective and reliable replication process, something that will create consistency. Consistency is key, unless you want your particular organism to start dying off. If you don't have consistency, you don't get the same cells, you don't get the same structure, you don't get the reliable functionality, and that means you start to lose out on key things over time, and as they're lost, your particular organism begins to die off. All it took was 19 new genes, with a fraction of these being responsible for that continued sustainability. Another piece of news in synthetic biology is the creation of a synthetic mucus. Mucus may not seem like the most exciting of substances. Most people know of it from when they have a runny nose from a cold or the flu. The fact that it comes out of your nose and is rather unpleasant is about the only thought that's given to it. Mucus has many more functions and can be applied in many more ways that aren't necessarily as obvious. It protects part of your respiratory tract, keeps things moist, keeps things wet. It does a lot in those terms. It also accounts for things like your immune system, where it acts as part of your protection. It does a lot for something that's often not considered very favorably. The difficulty with creating synthetic mucus has been something called mucins. These are the fundamental part of mucus, and they're a protein product. They're a very long and difficult protein product, with carbohydrate polymers called glycans found in them. This, in conjunction with the long protein backbone, means that they have a variety of properties that are quite useful. Being both protein and carbohydrate, you begin to see how we're mixing different kinds of organic matter, and this can be quite difficult, especially when you're talking about synthesizing it. It took us an incredibly long time to figure out how to synthesize the pure protein structure of insulin, and even then we had to go through multiple stages that took the methodologies available and improved on them substantially. Compared to the size of insulin, the mucins are far larger, or it'd be more accurate to say, far longer. That's why this research at this stage is just looking at those protein backbones. They haven't started to explore how to put the glycan into it yet. Their results simply from that protein backbone, though, are very encouraging. Less encouraging is research into AI and the creation of pickup lines. anytime you start trying to teach an artificial intelligence anything about humanity, there's a good chance it's going to go wrong. Microsoft has learnt this with their chatbot Tay. Tay was taught in very short order that humanity should not be trusted with technology. This AI looking at pickup lines is not quite as bad. Still, what came out of it in the end is confusing and a little uncomfortable. Some examples include, "I'm losing my voice from all the screaming your hotness is causing me to do," and another, "I will briefly summarize the plot of Back to the Future 2 for you." Not the kind of language that would cause someone to swoon, but then again, who knows? These pickup lines are what the AI started to generate after looking through various sources of information. Using 4 different AIs of varying complexity, they were able to have them generate a sort of pickup line in response to a stimulus, this being a particular heading. The heading used read, "These are the top pickup lines of 2021. Amaze your crush and get results." The most advanced AI came up with, "I love you, I don't care if you're a doggo in a trench coat." The next most advanced AI came up with, "Your eyes are like 2 rainbows, and a rainbow of eyes. I can't help but stare." The next one, "You're looking good today, want snacks." The final and least advanced read what could be more accurately considered marketing headlines, such as "body softening pads." When they gave the advanced AI another prompt, this time post-human AIs that were using them to flirt, the AI came out with lines like, "Hey baby, are your schematics compatible with this protocol? I can tell by your red power light that you're into me. Can I see your parts list?" And no, these aren't just lines from Futurama. These were actual results from the AI. In other technology-related news, although going to the astrological in this case, SpaceX has encountered yet another hiccup with their SpaceX Starship prototypes. Yet another one has had an accident. This time crashing. At least it hasn't caught on fire after crashing. The vehicle successfully deployed and launched itself towards space. It's when it was descending, and theoretically this is a reusable craft, so the descent should be stable, it did not land, it crashed, which isn't particularly helpful at the moment for SpaceX. It may be possible that they can extract useful data that will allow them to improve future launches and vehicles. The final piece of news we have for you is more an interesting statistic that we came across this week. Attendance at churches is at an all-time low. This might not come as a surprise for some people who will immediately say that it's no wonder with various lockdowns and other byproducts of the CCP virus. The problem is that this is not just a recent event. In fact, it's a continuation of a long-running trend, a trend that's been going for decades. The interesting thing here is not so much the long-running decrease, rather it's the various ways it can be broken down and examined. There's a more pronounced decrease in membership amongst women over the last 20 or so years. There is a larger decrease in non-Hispanic black adults versus white adults. The decrease among college graduates is far lower than amongst non-college graduates. These numbers can be looked at a number of ways over different time brackets, but looking at them in general, it's quite interesting, and a link to the original article where you can look at the other information and where they get this information from can be found in the description below. That's all the news we have for you this week. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.